If you're a gun owner in New York, things just got a lot more confusing. Let's talk about it. Hey there, welcome to the Shermichael Singleton Show. So this week, the Supreme Court, our nation's final arbiter of constitutional rights, declined to hear a challenge to New York's latest attempt to clamp down on the Second Amendment. At issue, a law that forces residents to prove they have good moral character. I don't know what that means. In order to carry a handgun, and that bans firearms with broad swaths of so-called sensitive places across the state. No explanation, no dissent, just silence, but no surprise, it's New York. But for gun control activists and New York politicians, it was a victory. For Second Amendment advocates, it's a troubling moment, one that may signal more confusion, more legal inconsistency, and more creative attempts by blue states across the country to defy the court's landmark 2022 ruling in Bruin, which was authored by Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. You all remember that case. Well, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin was supposed to reset the national standard. Supposed to. It made clear the right to carry a firearm in public is not a privilege. It's a right guaranteed by the Constitution. And any restriction must be deeply rooted in America's historical tradition. So then why 2 years later is New York essentially saying thanks, but no thanks to the court? To unpack the legal stakes, the political maneuvering, and what this means for millions of gun owners from coast to coast, I'm joined by one of the country's most respected voices on firearms policy, Stephen Gutowski, founder and editor at The Reload, and he's also a Read the Free firearms analyst. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Stephen, I just want to jump into this whole moral clause thing. Explain this. What exactly did the Supreme Court do this week in New York, and why is it significant? Because I've never heard of anything like this as long as I've been a gun owner.
Yeah, so it's interesting because this case that they denied, right? The Supreme Court decided not to take up this Second Amendment challenge to New York's concealed carry permitting law, and one of the main questions around it was this good moral character clause that they have in there. And it's kind of similar to the landmark case in Bruin, right? Where the Supreme Court took up the case and struck down New York's old concealed carry permitting law because they had a provision that made people show they had a special need, essentially, for a permit. And then the government official processing those applications, it would be up to them. It would be subjective on their part as to whether or not they thought the applicant really had a special need. And in practice, this meant most people didn't get permits. But they replaced that law, New York, after it was struck down, with a new version of their permitting law. And most of the restrictions are on the where you can carry side, but they do still have this somewhat similar provision where you're supposed to show that you have good moral character before they give you a permit. And gun rights activists who took up this case essentially are saying this is it's the same thing by another name. It's too subjective for them to have to, be able to say whether or not you have a good moral character.
Right.
It goes
So
beyond.
who gets to decide that?
Yeah, it's the same idea that the permitting officer would get to decide. Now, I think it's in practice, it's not as strict. It's not as subjective as the old standard, but it's still pretty similar idea, right? And they also pair that with a bunch of requirements of how you're supposed to show that you have good moral character, which is by getting references for other people. They want your social media accounts and even your anonymous social media accounts to see if you're posting threats or whatnot on there. So there's a lot of this stuff that's required that's well beyond what most states with concealed carry permitting processes require. And bottom line is the Supreme Court isn't going to decide. They're just they're leaving the lower court ruling in place for now, which upheld most of this law.
Which doesn't make sense. Stephen, we're talking about a law that requires people to have good moral character to carry a firearm. From a legal and constitutional standpoint, how subjective is that standard? And if you're a Second Amendment advocate or just a gun owner in general, hell, man, that makes me nervous because, as I just stated, who gets to decide if you have a good moral character. Okay, you got to get some references. Let's say you go get some good references, people who really love you, like your mama. And let's say you don't have a social media. You have a social media and you barely post, so there's not a whole lot for them to glean from that. But then you find out you're a homicidal maniac who just passed the good moral smell test. I mean, hell, there's no way to know, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, the wording of this kind of provision, it can go both ways to me, because sometimes you'll see these and they're just kind of enforced, like you just got to meet these check these boxes and we give you the permit. But on the other end, it can be a lot more subjective than that. And that was really the crux of the Bruin decision. What the Supreme Court handed down in that case was they didn't like this idea that somebody's constitutional right to carry a gun for self-defense. That's what the court found, right, in Bruin. You don't just have a right to own a gun. You have a right to bear your gun in public for self-defense. Mm-hmm. And they didn't like that right was subject to a very subjective, for lack of a better word, standard. They didn't want this idea that some government official can just say you don't get to exercise your right because I don't think you should.
Right.
They want something much more regimented than that, and that's what you see in most other states where they have what are called shall issue permits, where you pass the background check, you do the required training, and they have to give you the permit. There's no fiddling around about whether or not the official who's issuing the permits thinks you have a good moral character. Now sometimes, like I said, the background check could be considered a way of figuring out if you have good moral character, because it looks for whether or not you have convictions on your record. Now, some states like New York want to go beyond convictions, and that's where this comes in. They want to say, okay, even if you haven't been convicted of anything that disqualifies you, maybe there's some other stuff that we could find where we're going to set this higher bar for who can carry a gun beyond just people who haven't been convicted.
And even if someone was convicted, Stephen, that doesn't mean that they haven't been reformed. What's
Sure.
the extent of the conviction? I mean, that doesn't mean their rights should be banned in perpetuity, in my personal opinion. I mean, again, you brought up Bruin, and to me, that 22 ruling seemed crystal clear. Restrictions must be rooted in the historical and history and tradition of gun regulation since the founding of the country. But in New York's response, to me, is not in line with that. I mean, so is this essentially an open defiance to the Supreme Court's intent?
I mean, that's certainly how most gun rights activists look at it, with a lot of these Bruin response laws, right? Yeah, and I think you're in good company among gun owners and gun rights activists. That's the argument here, is that these are in violation of Bruin, what the Supreme Court held. I think on the other side, on New York side, what they're trying to do clearly, and this is not a partisan. This happens on a lot of issues on all sides, but they're trying to walk right up to the edge. Mm-hmm. They want to find that new edge. Okay, the Supreme Court said we can't do this. What if we do this?
Well, we can go just that far. We can violate your rights just that much.
They're just looking for where can we do before the Supreme Court steps in again and says no? And they might have found it because the Supreme Court just decided not to take this case. Now, I will say this is a case where they haven't gone through the merits. For some reason, the Supreme Court is very reluctant, or has been very reluctant in these recent cases since Bruin on the Second Amendment side, to take cases that aren't all the way through the merit stage. In federal courts, it takes forever to get through there. But.
Right. So pause there, Stephen. So do you think that this is perhaps a larger strategic pattern? That maybe the case is waiting for more favorable cases to clarify, these types of laws?
Yes. I mean, I think one thing that the court has been pretty clear about so far in that they've taken up a bunch of cases and done what's called granting, vacating, and remanding them. So there have been a lot of Second Amendment cases that have come up to the court asking for them to intervene and make their decision, where they've said, okay, we're going to take, what we're going to do is take this case, we're going to vacate the lower ruling, and then we're going to send it back down there so they can redo it again in light of all of our Second Amendment cases. So Rahimi happened in 2024, and they said for a bunch of these cases, all right, we want you to re-look at all of these, have it go through the whole system. They want to have it percolate. They want to see what all the lower courts are saying on either side, the majorities and the dissents, and then come to a. That's what it seems like they're doing.
So
and so that's one part of solace, perhaps, for gun rights advocates, for them not taking this case. They may just want more time.
Yeah, and you mentioned lower courts. I mean, let's talk about a little bit of precedent here. I mean, do you think the lower courts are wrestling with how to apply the historical tradition test from Bruin and Bruin? And if so, are they getting it right, or is the standard a little too vague and too open-ended? And maybe that's why we're sort of wrestling with some of these questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of dissent among the lower courts about the best way to apply Bruin, or the proper way to apply Bruin. Even basic questions like what section of history should you look at? Because the court hasn't settled all these questions, right? They've said stuff like the founding era is the best period, because the idea here, right, is we're looking at the area around when the Second Amendment was ratified, because that's when we're going to have the closest clues to what it meant to the people who ratified it.
Yep.
That's supposed to be the idea. And so if they allowed certain restrictions that, at the time of the founding on guns, then in theory, that would, the principle, at least the how and why they did that,
theory.
could certainly translate to modern restrictions.
Yeah.
So, and that's been something where you have, now I will say too, that a lot of the disagreements in the lower courts do appear to fall along ideological lines, right? Like you have
no surprise there, Stephen.
Right. I mean, this is reality. The judges are supposed to be not as partisan as the rest of us, but in real life, it happens that way a lot of times. And so you have a lot of more left-leaning courts that are upholding restrictions, and they're coming up with their own readings of Bruin to do it. And then you have right-leaning courts that are striking down restrictions, and they're taking a pretty opposite view of what Bruin says. And look, the court, I think, to what you alluded to here, they're going to need to take more Second Amendment cases. The real big problem they have, whatever you think of this standard, whether it's great or not, they need to explain it in much more detail. Because if you think about the First Amendment, there's hundreds of First Amendment cases that got us to the point where we are today.
Yeah.
So they've developed what the court thinks about the First Amendment, what it says, what it does and doesn't do. And Second Amendment, you've got 5 cases in the history of the court.
And maybe that's what Justice Thomas wanted, Stephen. I mean, to that comparison of the First Amendment, maybe Justice Thomas wanted to follow, while he's still here and beyond his life, a litany of cases that will sort of codify the Second Amendment. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and I think that's what gun rights advocates want. I mean, right now, given the makeup of the court, the nature of these cases is that gun rights advocates want to be at the Supreme Court, right? If you don't get to the Supreme Court with your Second Amendment case, it's considered a loss. That's what we're talking about right now. This case, the gun rights advocates that filed against New York wanted to get to the Supreme Court, and they haven't, and that's what people are worried about. Yeah, so I think Thomas laid this out in Rahimi, right? The case about the domestic violence restraining order gun ban, where the court upheld that federal gun restriction 8-1, Thomas being the one dissenter in that case. They went from Thomas writing the Second Amendment rule, the Second Amendment test in Bruin, and then he was in the one-person majority in the very next Second Amendment case they took. And his warning was, I feel like you guys are undermining what we did in Bruin, the standard that we set. Now, the other conservative justices their point of view on that was just, we're not doing that. We're just saying, in Bruin, they talk about a blank check and a straitjacket. And so they're saying this history tradition test is not a blank check to write any restriction on gun rights that you want, but it's also not a straitjacket to, keep all gun restrictions off the books. Yeah. And so it seems like what they're going to have to do is keep piling up cases to set the either end of that. What do they consider a blank check, and what do they consider the straitjacket? They've only done one, and it's on the straitjacket end at this point. So they need to start doing more if they really want to get to the meat of what the Bruin test means. Yeah,
no, Stephen, I think it's going to take us a long time to get to that point. Thank you to Stephen Kotowski for his insight. Leave your comments below the video. I'm sure Michael Singleton. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.